morning, Stephen. How are you?
Morning, Michelle. I'm doing pretty well. Not too many aches and pains for the old fellow that I have become.
I was going to ask, how are your aches and pains? How's your shoulder, your elbow, all that horrible
Which
stuff?
not too problematic. Left elbow is still kind of a problem, but I shall survive.
Have you started back on your invasives work, or are you still taking a pause from that?
Invasives light, yes.
Invasives light.
I
Okay.
have to figure out what tasks I can do without exacerbating my left elbow. But who cares about that? Nobody cares about that. So I thought that I would start off these sessions today with something a little bit special and different. What I thought I would do, I think a couple of weeks ago, I shared with everybody that I have written books besides my PL/SQL books. I've written some kids' books, and I think I showed them. So I won't do that.
Yes.
But I also write poetry. So I thought I'd share with you one of my favorite poems. It's proof, can I share my screen?
Yep.
It's proof of evolution by natural selection in haiku form. So folks, this is a quiz. We'll come back to it at the end of my talk after we talk about dynamic PL/SQL. I'm going to read it to you. And if any of you can figure out why this is proof of evolution by natural selection, you'll be amazing. And maybe I'll even explain it if we have time. So, proof of evolution by natural selection. Like our parents, but different from our parents. Can all be parents? Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. And I thought PL/SQL was hard.
I've been spending a lot of time thinking about evolution, and part of it was, how do you boil it down to its essentials and make it something that people can easily understand? And that's my version of that. Anyway.
All right. Well, I look forward to you breaking that down for us at the end of the show.
I will do that. So what I wanted to talk, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you before we dive into dynamic PL/SQL, I thought we might share with the audience here. So some of you know that, so Stephen is here every week doing Feuertips, but another thing that he does both for our consultants at Insum, but also clients, is he runs a program that we call Next Level PL/SQL. I'm just going to pop that up on the screen. If any of you do want to check it out, that's the link to find out about the program where you can work sort of more closely with Stephen. Beyond the program, we are actually going to be running a webinar to tell people a bit about it, and so that they can learn what to expect.
So at the webinar, we're going to do a next level PL/SQL session. I'm going to look at some code by one of the best people at Insum and tear it to pieces.
Anton Nielsen will be joining
in front of an entire world audience. No, he writes great code. But even when people write great code, like some people think I write great code, I don't think so. Anyway, you can find all sorts of interesting stuff to talk about in anybody's code. And so at the webinar, we're going to do that. And that'll give you a sense of the kind of engagement that we can do as a next level PL/SQL session.
Yep. So just wanted to, if anybody's interested, there's the link. Sign up. The webinar is obviously absolutely free, and you can learn more about the program. And that is all I had to say, Stephen. Over to you.
Okay. And I think that maybe showing folks my poem, that might have been a mistake. So now Mark wants me to do it in limerick form, which I'll definitely think about, Mark. And also, Rachel suggests do the whole Feuertip in iambic pentameter. I don't think I'm going to do that.
I don't even know what that. Oh, okay, Rachel.
I think it's a Shakespeare thing. It's like if you lived hundreds of years ago, you wrote an iambic pentameter. Thank you. I'm ignorant. Yes. Okay. We'll see, Rachel. We'll give it a shot. First, I will go to my search engine. Right. So what I want to do today is talk about dynamic PL/SQL. Now, I was originally thinking I'd start a little mini series on Feuertips on dynamic SQL. But then I thought that's such a big topic. I'd really like to narrow it down. Anyway, so I'm going to narrow it down to one of the more obscure areas of dynamic SQL execution in Oracle database, probably in the coming weeks, months, and years. I might also talk about other related dynamic aspects like dynamic SQL, SQL injection, et cetera. But for today, we're going to focus on something that maybe only a few of you have done, and many of you might never use, but I think you'll find it interesting. And when you do need it, wow, does it come in handy. So dynamic PL/SQL is when you construct and at runtime parse, compile, and execute a PL/SQL block, not a SQL statement, not a create and replace DDL statement, but an actual PL/SQL block. So I put out on Twitter, promoting the session here today that, if anybody has any use cases, share them with me. And the only person who responded was Sam Nietzsche in Germany, who said, Well, the only thing I can say is that 99.9% of the time, you're not going to want to use dynamic PL SQL. And no question.
Do you agree?
Sorry?
Do you agree?
Yes. Well, I don't know about the percentage. Could be right. But his point is correct, certainly about dynamic SQL and dynamic PL SQL. You use it when you need it.
Yeah.
And I'd say there are two kinds of need. One of the needs is, wow, I really don't have all the information I need at compile time to write static SQL or static PL SQL. Static SQL is more obvious. For example, I don't know the number of columns I need to retrieve, or the name of the table I'm selecting from, things like that. Fairly common situation, lots of challenges to it. Again, I'll come back to that. Dynamic PL SQL is definitely a more obscure application of dynamic execution. That's when you don't have all the information you need at compile time to write static PL SQL code. Now, the two clear use cases I know for this, and I'm sure there are others, but this captures most of what I've encountered. Number one, you'd want to use dynamic PL SQL when the code that you're going to execute may not exist at compile time. So I'm going to execute a procedure, or maybe one of several different procedures, but at the time I'm writing it, may not be there. The example here actually is pretty interesting. So the Oracle DevGem is a website with classes, quizzes, and workouts on Oracle database, SQL, PL SQL, and so on. Hopefully you've all checked it out. And kind of a sister site is Oracle Ask Tom, which I'm sure you all know about, the big Q&A site. And we added Ask Tom office hours a few years ago, and I was still with Oracle. The code base for most of Ask Tom and the management of the Ask Tom office hours feature is actually in the DevGem and in the DevGem schema. So we were building out code from the same base as the DevGem code to be used in Ask Tom. But the folks in Ask Tom world, namely Connor for sure, said, listen, I don't want to take a chance that if something's wrong on the DevGem side of things, the code base there, that Ask Tom will be in any way compromised. In other words, if office hours is screwed up in some way, Ask Tom Q&A is still going. And one of the ways we did that was to encapsulate calls to specific modules inside dynamic PL SQL blocks. So again, just a general use case, there's not much to show you with it. I'll be getting to examples in a minute. But for this particular use case, literally, if you're writing some code and you can't get it to compile because that procedure may not be there, dynamic PL SQL, and you can trap the error that it doesn't exist and deal with it. Okay, so let's share my screen. Let's say goodbye to Infinity Windows. Let's take a look at some examples. So the first example I want to show you is it's from ages ago. In fact, I'd forgotten about this until I started looking through all of my dynamic PL SQL files in my demo zip. And this is a true story from, I was with SSC, so it was probably about 92, 93, right after I left Oracle. And I was a consultant, and I was assigned to an insurance company in downtown Chicago. Now, insurance companies, they have had for many years a great business model. You give us money, and we pledge to help you out when things go bad in a big way. You give us little bits of money. When things go bad, we help you in a big way. But of course, the other part of that business model is when Stephen comes to claim their reimbursement, the help from the insurance company, then the insurance company does everything it can to avoid paying out. Obviously, that's their business model. Now, I say used to be a good business model because in the age of climate crisis, insurance companies are going to go bankrupt, or they're going to start telling people and organizations, companies, we're not going to insure you anymore if you live on the coast, if you live in a fire zone, et cetera. That's when things will really start happening. Okay, anyway, I was called in to help them with a piece of code, and the code roughly looked like this. Basically, they had lots of different line items in their policy saying, if you stepped on it first and slipped and fell, you don't get paid, this, that, and the other. And every time they had a new line item to add to the policy, they had to go into this procedure and add another clause like this. In fact, I think they were all if statements. They weren't even else if statements. So every single one would be executed. But every time they had to make a change, they had to go in and add a clause to this long else if statement. And Michelle, I kid you not, the reason I was called in to help with this is that this procedure had gotten to be so large that it often took like 20 minutes to compile, and they were afraid of actually getting to be too big for PL SQL. Now, this is a long time ago. Yeah, right at this point, it's pretty much impossible for any human to write a piece of PL SQL code that is too big. You have something like, I think, 16 megabytes of Diana code, which are basically the number of identifiers in your code is what it comes down to in terms of the limitation. you're not going to hit the limitation. But back then, they could have actually hit it. And of course, again, taking 20 minutes to recompile. Oh my God, it was crazy.
That makes it pretty tough to read and maintain. And
oh yeah, exactly. And I got to tell you, this is one of those situations where, as a PL SQL developer, I could be a total hero. The DBAs consultants have it so easy. Oh, my application's running really slow. Can you please help me? I'll pay you anything. Well, let's put on a couple indexes. Boom, fantastic. Here's $1 million. But us developer consultants, no, you don't have those moments like that. But this was one of those moments. Now, back then, honestly, when I was working on this code base, we didn't even have execute immediate native dynamic SQL. So what I offered to them was to replace their 30,000 line program, or whatever the heck it was, with this one 14-line program. So here's dynamic PL SQL. First of all, with dynamic PL SQL, you either have a use case like the code doesn't exist at the time I'm writing it, or I don't know, I'm passing in the name of the procedure to execute, something like that. But the other very common dynamic PL SQL use case is to get rid of an enormous amount of redundancy, repetition in your code. And the key thing there is identifying a pattern. Well, the pattern here was pretty clear. They would simply append the line item number next to process_line, of course, create that procedure and so on and so forth. So all I had to do was basically genericize that pattern, which is a lot of what dynamic PL SQL and even dynamic SQL is about. So in this case, it was pretty clear. Pass in the line number, append it to the process line procedure name, put it inside a dynamically constructed begin end block, and execute it. And with native dynamic SQL introduced, I think, in Oracle 9, maybe 8, it could just go down to one line. So execute immediate, put together the string, execute it. Isn't that sweet? From 25,000 lines of code to one line of code. That was a good day. It was silly that they had this problem, but you take what you can get. So that's the basic idea with dynamic PL SQL. Any questions or comments so far?
Mark commented, not so much on your code, but that insurance is like a casino.
That's right.
Yeah. I also had an issue with you claiming that you give little amounts of money to the insurance companies in exchange for money back. That is not true if you have 3 new young drivers, and I can attest to that fact. My insurance payments. But back to dynamic.
No, let's spend the rest of the time.
No.
One more thing, though. It's funny, my attitude was I'm giving them all this money. When something goes wrong, I'm going to make them pay me back. So we did that with our cars for a while. We'd have relatively small accidents, and we'd go and we had a low deductible, and we got it fixed. And like a year later, we got a letter from the insurance company saying, bye-bye. You're too expensive for us. It's pretty funny. And then the other story I'll tell you is, and then we'll get back to PL SQL. Maybe we had a hailstorm in Chicago, and so I think we had some dents in the car, but some damage to the house. And so there had been a hailstorm, no real damage that we could see, but we had squirrels that were breaking into a dormer on the roof and causing some damage. So we wanted to seal it off. So we had somebody come over for a quote, goes up there, takes a look around, comes back down, and he says, it'll cost you X $1,000 to fix this, seal this off. But you have hail damage. And he then proceeded to coach us in how to work with the insurance companies to get $17,000 of work done on our house, covered by insurance, new roof, new gutters. It was such a racket. We did need a new roof. We did need things being done, but it felt like a racket, and it was on my behalf. Okay. No more insurance.
I don't know if this is a dare to see if we're putting up any comment that gets put in. But Camel's video, I think I know what you're saying. If you're still around, I think you're saying hi, mom, dad, and hello to all parents. But let me know if that's right.
Is that Czech?
It looks like maybe Polish. So Polish is close enough to check that. Anyway, back to PL SQL. Rachel has a question here.
So what does DBMS SQL execute if there is no out mode parameter? Return if there's no. So DBMS SQL.execute returns a variable that tells you the number of rows modified by that statement. It's basically, I think, a poor design on the part of the DBMS SQL package. It should be a function or a procedure. And when you have DBMS SQL.execute is only a function. And mostly we don't care about the value being returned, and we just ignore it. We have to declare a variable and then say, ignore this. But Plummet says Plummet says, I think you were right about the Polish.
Yay. I'm not sure it's Polish. I'd love to know if that's what it was, but.
Okay. All right. So let's dive back into some code.
Yes. Do you want me to share your screen again?
Yes. Okay. So you saw this one example of shrinking down all this repetitive code down to zero. Let's just take a look at some other aspects of dynamic PL SQL. I'll show you this one. That's another conversion process. So let's talk about binding a variable. So in many ways, doing dynamic PL SQL is no different from a dynamic SQL. You have an execute immediate statement. You provide the statement, here's dynamic SQL. You have a using clause that allows you to bind in values to variables or local variables, parameters of local variables. And there's also an into clause, but the into clause is only for dynamic SQL select statements. You never use into with a procedure. So here's an example of doing binding of a SQL statement. And notice you can see that I have the same bind variable twice. Now, here's one big difference between dynamic SQL and PL SQL. In dynamic SQL, binding is by position, first position, second position. So even if it's the same named placeholder, you have to provide two values. Could be the same value, but you've got to provide n number of values for n number of placeholders. But with dynamic PL SQL, what you see here is I've got two different bind variables with the same name. And in this case, as you're, let's see, I think that I'm going to run this in LiveSQL because I was having some trouble over here. So let's take this, go to LiveSQL, see if I still got a session. Probably not.
Too much talking about insurance companies.
Yeah, but it's so much fun. Hopefully LiveSQL really isn't out. Thank you. Come on, you can do it. Okay. So I'll create this dynamic binds procedure. And it's not going to work because it has an employees. Oh, I did create the employees table. It looks like it's still there. Cool. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is what you might do at first glance when you're working with dynamic PL SQL and just getting started. So I've got two different bind variables with the same name. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice also something you don't usually see with dynamic SQL. You can provide the mode for the parameter. For dynamic SQL, it's always in. The only usings you have are sending stuff in. But for dynamic PL SQL, you might have an outer and out parameter, and you have to match up the modes here. Of course, if it's an out or an in out, you've got to have a variable. You can't have a static expression. So when I try to run this code, it says bind variable does not exist. And what that means is I'm trying to bind in something here, and there's nothing to bind it to. But if I take it out, then I get a different error. That's okay. Table of view does not exist. But it didn't give me the binding error. So that's one thing to remember with dynamic PL SQL. You have to bind by name, not position. Another interesting aspect to dynamic PL SQL, and this is the one that's, you can see it's still running. I think maybe I started running this yesterday, and then I killed the session or something, and so it's hanging. I'm not sure. Anyway, let's take a look at the code in LiveSQL. I've got my little test procedure, update everybody's last name. And what I'm going to show you is some interesting behavior regarding SQL% row count. So SQL% row count returns the number of rows modified by the most recently executed SQL statement in your session. So what I'm going to do is call it from right inside. I do the update, then I see what the SQL row count is. Okay, and by the way, if I send in a negative number, we'll raise no data found so we can look at the error behavior. So here's my, first of all, just straight execute immediate. So I'm going to try to execute something that doesn't exist. And that'll give us the error, show us what the row count was at that point, SQL code, SQL error message. Then I'm going to try running my procedure with a negative. So that'll raise an error. We'll just see what the difference in behavior is. And then I'll run it for a positive number. And we'll take a look at SQL row count both inside the procedure and afterwards outside. Run my code. Okay. So in the first case, my SQL percent row count was 0 with a minus 6550. The program did not exist, the blah.blip. Okay, second, I ran it for dynamic SQL test. It's in valid. Wait a minute. That would certainly be a update employees. Hold on, let me grab this out of here. Run this. It really means it. Table of view. Okay, I guess because I reconnected. So there is an employees table, but it's in the HR schema. So if you want your own employees table, this is the best way to do it. So I'm going to create the table as a copy of the HR table, create the procedure. Much better. Okay, now let's run my script. Okay, so obviously blah.blip must be declared, no problem. Okay, then we had a failure. So this code failed. Whoop, my procedure failed. So it came down here and it said SQL row count is 0. Well, that's fine because no rows are modified. Here's the interesting one. And let me get the code back up to show it to you. So from the inside, I ran the update. I updated 107 rows in the employees table. Perfect. But when I came out here to see the SQL percent row count, it's 1. It's always 1. So if your dynamic PL SQL block returns successfully, at that point, that is the most recently executed SQL statement in your session. Even though we think about a begin-end block as being PL SQL, it's actually considered a SQL statement for the Oracle database. And I don't know if many of you remember, I'm sure you remember Bryn Llewellyn. He was the longtime PL SQL product manager. He famously pushed really hard internally and externally to recognize the begin-end block as a SQL statement, and this certainly verifies that. So the last statement I executed was a PL SQL block, and so the number of rows modified, for whatever reason, set to 1. So again, if you want to look at SQL percent row count, you can't do it. In other words, you have DML inside your procedure or function that you're executing, and you want to see what happened inside that dynamic execution. You got to do it inside that code. You can't wait till afterwards. All right. In terms of overhead, so another question that often comes up is, well, what kind of price do I pay for doing dynamic PL SQL? And again, a reminder, it's a good question to ask. You should be aware of it. But the bottom line is that you're only going to use this when you really need it. And that, again, could be a use case like the code might not exist at compile time, or you've got some major problems with your code redundancy. And I'll actually come back and show you this one in a moment. But a lot of code redundancy you're getting rid of, and that can be a significant issue for a number of reasons. So the question is there a lot of overhead? So I put together a script to test this. It's actually on LiveSQL too. In fact, if we go to LiveSQL and search, you'll find a number of scripts on dynamic PL SQL. Whoops. Including performance. So you'll see the same thing here. So I basically just run my code natively and then run my silly code dynamically. And by the way, when you put together scripts like this, don't do this. Now, let's say I just wanted to test the performance of a query. Anyway, whatever it is, you've got to do something that you're testing. Otherwise, the optimizer could just null it out and you won't get good results. So in this case, I'm forcing it to do a computation and then display the value. So they can't do any optimization shortcuts here. Same thing with my dynamic execution. And here's what I found. So this is running over 1 million iterations. It took 0.03 of a second to do 1 million iterations of essentially aggregating a numeric value. That's nice. That's fast. It took 7.3 seconds instead of 0.03 seconds to do it with dynamic PL SQL. And you'd say, whoa, that's really slow. Well, it's true. It's much slower. It's like 2 orders of magnitude slower. But remember, that's 1 million iterations. Mm-hmm. So per iteration, generally speaking, this is true not only for dynamic PL SQL, but dynamic SQL. Don't worry about the overhead of going dynamic. The cost of running your actual code, your query or your block, is almost certain to overwhelm the overhead of going through the execute immediate layer, which is quite nice. And I think a real accomplishment on the part of the PL SQL team for doing that. Okay, let's see. Any questions or comments we should take a look at?
Not related to dynamic PL SQL. Kevin was remarking that you were using Firefox browser and had some comments about.
Huh.
Don't know what people's favorite browsers are. I use Chrome all the time, I have to say.
Chrome and Firefox are definitely memory hogs. I don't know if Edge is much better.
Yeah.
I'm on a Mac. Can you run Edge in a Mac? Maybe you can. But maybe we'll do a survey on your browser soon. Okay.
The only thing I wanted to mention, Stephen, audience, Stephen does a great job every week. He actually writes a blog post to go along with each of these episodes. So by the end of the afternoon, the blog post for this session will be up. It goes into some of the use cases, the performance implications that you just covered. So be sure to check it out let me find I will put that up in a second on the Feuertips page, which is here. If you want to catch
search on Feuertip, it's a pretty good little. So I think we're pretty much done with dynamic PL SQL. I could go through this other example, which is fun, but we're at 11:25. Basically, this is real world code that was given to me to look at, and again, you see this incredible pattern of repetition. And so, what you need to do is look for those consistent patterns that you can do replacements on, and eventually, again, I don't think I'll take the time to go through all this, but I converted it into a piece of code that looked like this. So I found a way to put the naming conventions into a table and then use that table to drive the construction of the call to the appropriate procedure. And then I do a single for all insert instead of the sequence of for all inserts you see here. Again, I don't think it's worth going through the detailed analysis of it. Maybe I'll do that in the next level PL SQL session because we have something similar going on with Anton's code.
Good idea.
The bottom line is if you see a lot of repetition, you could say that's just the way it is. Sometimes it's not worth getting rid of the repetition for unquestionably more complex code. It's not rocket science. It's not that hard to understand, but it's certainly more complex. It may not be worth it. You do need to justify using dynamic PL SQL or SQL to avoid redundancy. But in many cases, it's not that hard to justify. And just to make a final point, one of the other advantages of going dynamic is, for example, in the original insurance example, when they added a new process line number, they no longer had to change their code. All they had to do was make sure that procedure was created and it automatically worked. Same thing with this other more complex demonstration here. If I added a new category, instead of having to go in and modify this code, adding another for all, et cetera, I could just go and add a row into this categories table and boom, done.
Yep.
So hopefully you're all familiar with the advantages and potential downsides of soft coding your applications. You can certainly overdo it, but if you find the sweet spot, it can be very sweet. Okay, well, I think that ends our formal presentation. What have we got here? Works well when we run it to do a search joining standard and custom tables, where each client can create their own tables and search condition defines. Okay, and Hamal, is this actually dynamic PL SQL with a begin end or dynamic SQL? Think about that. Let me know, because from what you're telling me so far, you've got it. They can create their own tables. So if the only thing that's dynamic is a table, you're generally going to end up with dynamic SQL, which is special enough as it is. Dynamic PL SQL is a little bit edgier. Okay.
Have you seen Mark's comment? Mark has taken a stab at your poem.
Well, there once was a mom and a dad, the best parents I ever had. Then I had a kid, the best thing I did, and I'm the best they ever had. Well, I like it, Mark. I'm not sure it's a proof of evolution by natural selection, but I'll think about it. It might be. Okay, so let's go on to the closing segment, the soft part of our session. So I'm going to share with you one of my favorite books. I'm going to first throw up three different organizations. And Michelle, have you picked a person you'd like to have pick the organization? I think we should go with Mark personally.
Yeah, I agree.
So Mark, here are three organizations. I'm going to share my screen.
Oh, we're not doing this well, the whole infinity stuff, but that's okay. People will forgive us.
I'm sure they will. So Mark, you decide which one we should give $25 to this week. The first is Earth Justice, because the Earth needs a good lawyer. Many, many gains have been made in terms of healing our planet and saving species from extinction by lawyers who are acting on behalf of humans and non-humans, but mostly non-humans. So there's that. the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. I cannot feel more strongly about this. Every child should learn about evolution by natural selection. You can even believe in God. You can even believe in intelligent design and just realize that evolution is, my God, such an elegant, intelligent design. Anyway, I think it's really important that we support teachers' understanding of evolution and the teaching of evolution. And finally, save our monarchs. What I really like about trying to save our monarchs is that so many of us in the United States, at least, can actually concretely take action by planting milkweeds in their property and helping monarchs make it down to Mexico, survive another season and come back. And it's getting pretty desperate. There's a tiny percentage of monarchs left compared to the way it used to be. And it'd be awful to see an iconic species like that go. So Mark, think about it. Let us know when you've decided which of these groups: Earth Justice, Teacher Institute for Evolution, Save Our Monarchs. And my book of the week, I'm going to go back to science fiction and fantasy. I read a lot of that. Boy, do I need to escape from this world now and then. And one of my all-time favorites is a book called Elantris. And you can see it here. It's by a guy named Brandon Sanderson. If you are a sci-fi fantasy reader, you're probably familiar with Brandon Sanderson. He became extremely popular. And he was one of those guys who starts out with these really tight, short books and ends up producing like 16 book series, each book of which is like 1,500 pages long. I used to read them. I just couldn't deal with it anymore. But Elantris is a beautiful, elegant, tight book. It's one of those books where every single thing that's talked about and written about in the early chapters all feed into the ending, the climax. It's just an amazing book. It'll grab your attention. Great characters. Can't say enough about it. So if you do like fantasy novels and you haven't yet read any of Brandon Sanderson's stuff, or if you have and you haven't read Elantris, go back and check it out. All righty. Do we have a selection, Mark?
Teach the kids can't grow a tree without planting seeds.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. I'm so glad you chose the institute. We'll send them some money. Okay, is there anything else we should talk about? We talked about insurance. Oh, my poem.
Well, you do have to wrap up with your poem, yes.
For those of you who are still around, this is can you show my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. This is my boiling down of evolution by natural selection. Like our parents means inheritance. So we inherit genes from our parents. We tend to look like, act like, be like our parents. But we're also different from our parents, mutations. So every one of us has differences compared to our parents and even any of our siblings, anybody else. Sometimes our legs might be longer. Sometimes we might be strong in certain ways. Sometimes we're born without all our limbs. And all these variations have an effect on the last one, which is, sorry, can't all be parents. And think about that last one this way. What if every rabbit offspring survived long enough to reproduce and produce another litter of rabbits and all of them survive? How long would it take both for them to start to starve, but many other species to be drastically affected? Basically, every species, every individual of every species cannot reproduce. Otherwise, the world is overrun and everything falls apart. And that has to do with adaptation. So in a nutshell, this explains how evolution by natural selection works, right? The genes that are reproducing, because they had some kind of advantage or luck in some cases, made it to the next round, are able to reproduce again. And whatever helped them stay alive and survive to reproduction tends to get reinforced because we're like our parents. But if we were only like our parents and cloned from our parents, of course, there'd be lots of downsides or even upsides. Some of the biggest and oldest surviving individuals of any species are aspen trees and other kind of cloned entities that are literally acres long, acres wide, and tens of thousands of years old. So cloning has its advantages too, but not for those of us who use sexual reproduction. Then we really want to be also different from our parents. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And I'll just leave you with this final thought. To me, understanding and accepting evolution by natural selection is exactly equivalent to understanding and accepting logic. Evolution is completely logical, and to deny it is to deny really the same things that we use to build cars and write programs and everything else. Okay, well, that's sure to be controversial to somebody, but hopefully not.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the emails to start or the tweets to start rolling in. But that's what people join for, the great PL SQL, but also your
my edgy rants.
Yes, there we go. Oh. I didn't want to call them rants, but
I gotta say, nobody on these calls, on these Feuertips, have ever seen me rant. You'll know it when you see me rant. And the way things are going, you might be seeing some rants, but so far I think I'm doing pretty nice.
I've seen him rant. It's not a pretty sight.
But it was exciting, right? Really exciting.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks everybody for joining us this week. Hopefully you're continuing to tolerate my silliness. Do, let us know if you feel like I'm going too far, right? Come for the PL SQL, stay for the philosophy. and the jokes. Don't forget the jokes.
There you go.
All right, folks. See you next
Bye, everyone. See you next week.
Hope you find ways to use dynamic PL SQL soon. Yes. Take care, everybody. Happy coding. Stay safe.